to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 25, and today we're going to be talking about the assumption that's just the way it is. Now, this is a really interesting one for me. It's something I've heard very many times in my life, and I don't think it's ever really been that helpful. But people have told me a lot, so it'd be really interesting to get into. And today's guest is Stephen Dargan. Thank you very much for joining us on the show, Stephen.
Pleasure to be here, Matthew.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. If you're new to Delightful Dissent, or you haven't watched for a little while, this show is really about working with those hidden assumptions and the barriers and the shoulds that we carry around stuff that are just kind of there, kind of part of the furniture, but that actually don't serve us. And it's a show about challenging those. Comes out of my work with divergent pathfinders, people doing something different. And very often these assumptions are the things that get in the way of them doing their amazing stuff. It's supposed to give you some ideas, and help you out with a specific topic today. But perhaps more importantly, it's also, I hope it will give you ideas about how you can get out there and do this for yourself. Because I'd like to see a world where everyone is out there challenging assumptions and doing stuff different. It's called Delightful Dissent because it's about saying this isn't quite right, but doing so in a positive way, in a joyful way. It's not about winning an argument and proving someone wrong. It's about exploring ideas and being comfortable doing that and seeing where things go, rather than having to have all the answers up front and then have an answer that proves everyone else completely wrong and you completely right. This show is genuinely live, so please do bear with us if we have any technical issues or any distractions in the background. Hopefully it won't happen, but sometimes it does. We do sometimes talk about personal and challenging topics, so do be aware if there's stuff in this space that might be difficult for you, that might come up. And we might also use strong language. So if that's an issue for you, then just be warned. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is very much about asking questions for yourself too. So yeah, do ask questions to yourself, but ask questions to us as well. If you comment on the video, we'll be able to see, and we can bring that in. So if you've got any comments or questions, please do bring those in. We'd love to hear from you. If you're watching the recording or listening to the recording, there are contact details in the show notes to get in touch with either of us. So that will be available too, and we'll talk about that a bit more at the end of the show. So yeah, I first met Stephen, I think it was a good few months ago now, at the Happy Startup School events again. But I was really struck by kind of his really interesting approach to work and working with work, and actually quite a lot similar to mine in a funny way, but it's not a very common approach. So I was really pleased to see him doing that, and also his real kind of a gentle kind of effectiveness, rather than a very kind of pushy thing, but still something really interesting there. So I really wanted to get Stephen on the show. But that's probably enough of me doing the introduction. So if I could ask you to introduce your work a little bit and the kind of people that you like to work with, please.
Well, thanks very much, Matthew. Lovely introduction. Yeah, I'm Stephen Dargan, and I'm inherently interested in what I can do to be able to help organizations, to be able to create those leaders in those organizations, to be able to create places that sort of light people up, that make people feel the best that they can be, so that when they turn up to work, they do their best work, and then they get a chance to go home. And I suppose I've been inherently interested in that since I started work years ago, and sort of got really shocked by the fact that work was pretty difficult a lot of the time, and pretty, I suppose, pretty time consuming. I remember the first really sort of full-time job that I had, I panicked, not realizing it came to Easter, and I just come out of college thinking that Easter holidays now were going to be 2 weeks off, and then realized when I said to somebody in the organization, says, I'm really looking forward to the Easter holidays, and they said, Easter holidays? And I said, yeah. He says, well, what do you mean Easter holidays? And I said, well, they're coming up next week. It's Easter week, so I'm looking forward to some time off. And he said, there's no time. Did you book time off? I said, what? No. He says, well, we've only got Easter Monday off. And I said, are you serious? And they said, yeah. I said, is that it? So it was really sort of it was my immaturity in many ways, I suppose, caught me up on that. But I'm interested in if that we're in the working space for the amount of time we are, which is 8 or 9 hours or 10 hours a day. How can we make that a space where we feel better being there, and then when we leave it too as well? So that passes from us into our relationships, to our families, into our communities, and to wider society in general. If everybody worked in a workspace that concentrated on making them feel good, everything else would fall into place, and society and communities would feel completely different. Everyone would benefit.
I love that. I think it's a really important point to make, that, you know, when we do stuff that makes us miserable, when we work in a way that doesn't make us happy, we have to compensate for that somehow. And quite a lot of the issues I see around us are really, that we feel, if we do work that makes us feel hollow, and we need to feel that somehow, and usually in less healthy ways or less sustainable ways than we would otherwise. And I think certainly that's been my experience in the past as well. So I think that's a really great thing to be working on. I think it's really really positive, and having genuine systemic effect by working with work in that space. I do like to ask my guests for a quote that kind of helps, gives a bit of a different perspective and maybe supports their position a little bit, or gives us a new light on the thing. So have you got something you'd like to share with us around that?
Yeah, I love the quote that Nick Marks came out with a while ago. Miserable people do miserable work. And I just think it is so telling in that, and it's the idea that, I suppose, that and many of our organizations have been very good at being able to create miserable workspaces, and wonder why production and turnover and employee engagement is so low. It's because we've done a very good job of creating a world of miserable work. And I just think it's a lovely quote.
Absolutely, I do too. I think it's for me, this idea of, it does seem to be a really big idea that work needs to be miserable, on some level. That there's something important in there's value in it being miserable, and it's such a counterproductive strategy for an organization to adopt, to make its people more miserable than necessary.
Yeah. And it just reminds me of all the Dickens books I had to read in school, where the miserable industrial revolution life that people experienced in the early 19th century, where miserable was the theme of the century, really, when you think about it. That's changed now. That is, we don't need to do that anymore, and that's one of the things I do. I have the tools. I help organizations and leaders within the organizations to be able to transform that, so that the world of work becomes a place where people feel good about themselves. And we know that when people feel good about themselves, they light up different parts of their brain. When those different parts of their brain light up, they're more creative. They shut off the amygdala. They're less stressed. And all of the parameters in work begin to change positively for them, the organization, the teams that they work for. And years ago, that probably worked very well in an environment where everything was algorithmic and everybody worked in manual labor. That's changed. We all now work in tasks that involve cognition. And most of us are trying to solve problems, or create new ideas, or come up with solutions. So that's cognition. And the cognition that we use, then, we know can easily be corrupted by, and what we discovered with lots of studies, is easily corrupted by finance, by bonuses, by money. Any of the studies that have been done by Dan Ariely, the psychologist and the behavioral organization expert, and even the stuff that's been written about from Dan Pink, and then Adam Grant has done some really great stuff around all of this, have discovered that we've gone down the wrong road, where we've given people financial rewards for tasks that really are corrupted by the more money that we lay onto it. Then thinking that it's solving an answer or feeding a need, and it's not. Any organization that really wants their people to feel good must pay them a good salary and a good wage, so they're not fighting over food on the table and roofs over their head. So once you've got those basic needs met, you can start working on the other hierarchical needs within the pyramid. And that's organizations in the modern age, and from now into the future, should be working with. But unfortunately, we've created a world of work where there's lots of miserable people, because we've brought some disruptors into the world of work that think they're doing all these great things, and they are on their way. They're making billions, and it's paper. It's not paper billions, but it's money that's been made off the backs of people who are working in miserable jobs to fund that idea. It sounds great in a boardroom, but it's a bit shit to be you at the bottom, the guy that's working in the procurement center for Amazon or being the delivery driver. I saw the delivery driver around here, and it's the first time it's ever come to my my area, because I live in a small part of the southeast of Ireland here, a small town of, God, there might only be 20,000 people maximum in the town. So it's a small town. And we had a delivery driver on his bicycle in the lashing rain last night, heading up the road. And you just go like, God, you know, you're working for $1 billion. I don't know what was the IPO in the end that it came out. It was less. Yeah. It was far less than they expected.
Oh, really?
Yeah, far less than expected. But it's still worth billions. And he's pedaling his bike up the road in the lashings of rain, just trying to have enough money to possibly pay for his rent. And you just go, God, it's tough for some people. They're in a miserable.
I think it does bring us really nicely to look at the assumption that we're looking at today, which is that's just the way it is. And I think that idea that, you know, it has to be that way, we have to do that, is definitely, you know, it feels like that. You know, it's so often, if you said that, I think lots of people would think that, you know, that would be the response. You know, well, that's just the way it is. That's what it is to be that kind of person, and that's what's necessary. And I think it's a really, really interesting one. But this ability to change things, and for us as individuals to change things, feels like a really big part of this. You know, that we don't have, that it's okay for company owners and, like, you know, disruptors to do this, but that no one else is allowed to challenge things, to think about things differently and to do it differently. And I think this is actually one of the really big, you know, and it feels very related to the happiness. It's like, it's okay, you know, if you win, you can be happy. If you're at the top of the organization, you can live a life that you like. But at the bottom in other parts, then you can't. I don't think that's true, by the way, as a mechanism. I suspect that that the misery probably accumulates up the organization for most leaders, and they find themselves even more miserable because they're the kind of fulcrum point of that unhappiness. But I think it's definitely something that we hear people say, though.
Yes.
So yeah.
I actually run a conference every year on workplace happiness over here in Ireland. So I guess the leaders in the organizations and the genuine companies that are doing good, I get the leaders in the organizations to talk at the conference every year. We usually had it in person, and for this year was the very first time we've had it on an online forum, and it was fantastic. We had wonderful speakers from. This year we had Tony's Chocolonely, the chocolate company that's based in Amsterdam, who are doing lots of really good things on the ground, not just for the employees within the organization, but the cocoa suppliers in West Africa. And they had a fantastic, message to speak about, about looking at the products we buy and looking behind the curtain to see what's going on behind that. And I thought that was wonderful. Now, I've just mentioned, and I also had another speaker, Andrew Barnes, talking about the 4-day working week, which was fantastic. His company have done that for the last 2 years, a Perpetual Guardian, a company based in New Zealand. But before the conference happened, actually, sometimes I get certain companies contacting me to say, listen, they'd like to speak at the conference. And there is one of those big disruptor companies, and I might have mentioned them earlier, did actually send me an email and said, can you throw our name in the hat? We'd like to speak at the conference. I said, not a problem. If you can explain to me, I sent a really kind email back, said, yeah, no problem. We get people to talk about workplace happiness and what they do for their employees. And just send me back the details of, what you've done. And we can work around you speaking at the conference and talking about that particular topic. But I never heard anything back because I knew behind it all, there was nothing. And they just wanted to, I call it yellow washing. They just wanted to turn up at the conference, look good by saying we attended the Happy Workplaces conference, we're speaking at it. And by default, we're happy. And unfortunately, there's a lot of that goes on in industry, whether it's around, greenwashing with, fuel companies and the ecology and the environment, and it's yellow washing with us as well.
Yeah. I think this really gets to the heart of the that's just the way it is thing for me, and the fact that I don't really see anything as that fixed, but there are things that are kind of systematic and emergent, and actually that's what we're talking about here. It's not that it's fixed, and it's not that we can't do anything about it. It's just that it means changing a whole load of stuff around it and shifting around it. And I think feelings and how we feel about our work is actually part of that. Obviously, I want to get into a bit later when we start talking about exactly how we do these things. But we shift one bit and then we shift another bit, rather than being able to go all the way there or talk about it and pretend we're going to do it and then just say we're going there. It doesn't work in quite that way. And it, exactly as you said before, in that kind of more mechanistic production line thing, when we approach this stuff, it doesn't, just the metaphors don't really work very well. I think there's something really, but the instinct is still there in managers and leaders to talk about it as if we can do that, as if we can kind of magic it in by, okay, we'll all believe this, and it's one of those really weird things, and we've touched on it in the show before, is that on some level, beliefs do construct your reality, but you can't fake your beliefs by thinking yourself into them.
I like that. I like that, because so many organizations seem to do things, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. They have things like they might have Employee Happiness Day or Mental Health Week or Employee Week or whatever, something based around it. It's almost like box ticking, it is in many ways. And I go, like, if you're only going to have that for a day or for a week, what's the rest of the year like? Is it just a free-for-all then, and it turns back to trenches and warfare and all this kind of other stuff that goes along inside the workplace? And I have a feeling it is a lot of that. It's just ticking boxes, and it's not really paying attention to what really, really matters. So somebody high up, the CEO or the board of directors, suddenly gets a memo to say, we had our workplace wellbeing week. It went really well because we had some yoga, we had some mindfulness, and then somebody came in and talked about fresh fruit. And that's generally what a lot of it is, isn't it? Because that's exactly what Goldman Sachs just did a few weeks ago.
Sorry, it's just, I think you summed up so many of those kind of well-meaning but completely ineffectual wellness efforts in mindfulness, yoga, fresh fruit. That's
it. Those three
that's
things.
That's the whole strategy.
And that's where we're getting a bit lost, because people think that's it. It is beanbags and it's foosball and it's ping pong tables and all that kind of stuff. And they're lovely add-ons into the workplace, but they're not equated with workplace happiness. So getting back to the workplace sort of well-being weeks and all the kind of stuff that they have, that they think they filled it. Like I mentioned Goldman Sachs there. Remember, Goldman Sachs had the issue then with the employees about 4 or 5 weeks ago, wasn't it? That the employees of the age of 22 in the organization suddenly said they were no longer willing to work the 100-hour working weeks that was expected of everybody who had just joined the organization. And like, if you try to even work out the mathematics of what a 100-hour working week feels like or looks like, it's incredible. It is absolutely incredible. You're talking about 16 hours a day, pretty much for the week. And to make up for it, because we live in a world of transparency now and things get out very quickly. You might never have heard about this years ago, but now it gets out because there's Twitter and there's all sorts of forms of social media where this information can be transferred to people. And then obviously there must have been a board meeting, or the CEO in the organization got a bit of a fright, and then he said, listen, let's send out a little hamper to all the employees who have been unsettled by this. And that's exactly what they did. They put in free fruit, and they told them that there was yoga on at 12 every Tuesday, and join in. And I said, listen, we don't even have time to cook our own food, let alone get onto online yoga classes at 12 o'clock. And it's the ridiculousness of it, it's a disconnection from it. Because remember, I spoke about Dan Ariely, and Dan Ariely had made this huge equation that we have in the working place, that once you throw money at something, you corrupt somebody's ability to be able to solve the problem quicker than anybody else would. And he said, I've done studies on this, and I think I don't know if it was the Bank of England, but it was one of the British banks and one of the English banks that he did contact. And he said, I think I have an answer to some of the problems that you're experiencing. And it's around finance. And if you can get me to talk to you, I think I can help you for the better. And they said, no, we're okay. Thanks very much. And they didn't take him up on the offer, even though all the science behind it goes to prove that he was right. And he could have brought them down a road that would have been it would have been long term. It would have been a longer term road to go down, but it would have been far more effective if they had taken that.
I think this is one of the things is that puts people off, and when people say that's just the way it is, what they mean is we can't change that in a single step. We can't solve that. I often talk about resolving things rather than solving things, because solutions imply being able to figure everything out and actually kind of completely get to a fixed endpoint. And no complex system behaves that way. So no organization, no individual, nothing. We just don't work that way. So it's a strange metaphor to use again, really. And I think that one of the big instincts is that it'll, because it takes time, it's almost not worth it, or because we can't get to a certain predefined end goal, it's not worth it. But really importantly, I think, you also kind of mentioned one of the really risky aspects of change. And I think that's just the way it is often feels safe for some people. But one of the really big risky aspects is technology is changing around us. The world is changing. The context is changing around you. So if you don't update, you don't change, you don't respond to what's going on in the wider business context. For example, if you're recruiting people who have different expectations about their life than the previous generation of people that you recruited, if you can't meet those and you can't change in response to those, you're going to eventually reach a point of unsustainability.
Mm-hmm.
Things are going to stop working.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is actually the kind of the flip side, the stick side of change, and why we do update things is because not only is it about, we might make things better and there's a nice side, there's actually quite a serious uncertainty introduced by not updating and responding to changing context.
Yeah, and I think it's something that all organizations now need to be more aware of than ever before. The Gen Zers, the 21-year-olds, 19-year-olds that are leaving college and moving into the workspace are not going to accept the working environments that we would have accepted when we first started to work, or for maybe a lot of our working lives, certainly what our parents would have experienced. That's gone. Nobody's willing to sell their soul to the organization, for their couple of pieces of silver. That's gone. And people have sort of stronger awareness of values, of the effects of what we do in organizations and how that affects the rest of the world. So no longer can we sit in a factory making munitions, in a part of wherever it is, whether it's Sweden or the UK, and now not realize that it has a bigger impact somewhere else in the other side of the world. I'm just picking that as an example, but there's lots of. I worked for a biscuit factory for years, quite happily making biscuits. Thought I'm making biscuits because biscuits make people happy, and it's grand that biscuits do make people happy, and it makes me happy when I have a biscuit. But at the end of the day, if you're working for an organization, and that wasn't the goal of the organization when it started, was that we had to have endless advertising to ensure that people bought our products constantly. Like the McDonald's model isn't based around call in whenever you feel happy, or call in whenever you feel like you might like an out burger, or a milkshake, and that might be once every 2 months. That model doesn't work for McDonald's. That's why they advertise all the time. Like, I don't get Apple advertising constantly onto my screen all the time. I know they're there and I buy their product and I enjoy it. But McDonald's has to constantly tell me, don't forget about us. Coca-Cola does the same. They do it all the time because their products really aren't good enough for you to want to really, make your own decision on whether you want it or not. You need to be reminded by little funny little adverts, little funny colors, little funny little trinkets, a little toy think for your kids, and you just keep going back. McDonald's are the biggest toy distributor in the whole world. No one distributes more toys than McDonald's. It's incredible.
I think it's a really interesting thing, and those business models that were a thing, and what you need to keep that business model running when it stops being the thing. It's like, clearly when McDonald's started, they succeeded by being a fast food company. They did serve people in a way that worked for them, and worked and scaled very, very well. But it becomes that it's like you've got your shtick and then you stay with it. We can't change the organization and the way that the organization works because we're afraid, because it's too expensive, because it will take too long. And so what you end up doing instead then is kind of inveigling yourself in the market, getting stuck in there, making it rather than making yourself a positive contribution, you start to make it just hard to remove you. And that's a very, very different thing. That kind of defensiveness doesn't really serve you, your employees, your customers, or anyone or society long term. I think that kind of defending a position like that, and I'd also include viciously litigious tech companies in that.
Mhm.
Yes, benefit from technology. Yes, you've done R&D, brilliant. But if you've bought a bunch of patents from a company that went bankrupt 30 years ago, and now you're suing the crap out of every small company who goes anywhere near it, that's not a positive thing.
No, it's not.
And so it's like, so how are we doing this? And I think this idea of kind of developing and yeah, context develops, brilliant. We can develop and we can change as a collective, allowing that to change, and actually giving your customers credit for the fact that they'll be able to keep up with that.
Yeah. God, I even think about when you talked about that, being tech companies being litigious and holding on to their cards as if anybody else found out about what they found out how to do what they do, and then their whole model would fall apart. Like, even think about where we are now. It's the the COVID pandemic that's gone on, vaccinations that have been designed by the various pharmaceutical companies. You think they'd all be allowed to become open source, so that hundreds of generic companies can decide to build the exact same vaccines, distribute the exact same vaccines, and vaccinate the whole world at a far quicker space, far quicker pace than the pharmaceutical companies can do at the moment. That would make complete sense. Complete sense it would be to do something like that. And before you know it, then we're not listening to the sad news that we're hearing about India and the Far East and other parts of the world. The mutations that are happening, all those things going on. It just makes total sense. Yet we're holding on. Not everybody is not. I think it's isn't it the Oxford one is free? Is that the one that they're offering free? There's something going on there that seems a bit more sort of charitable there. But certainly, yeah, the idea, just open them up and get the whole world vaccinated for the betterment of everybody.
It's one. I think it's a really, really interesting example, because one of the that's just the way it is this idea of winners and losers, and that we can separate ourselves, and we can kind of insulate ourselves. But we're very clearly in a situation where we're not really safe until everyone is vaccinated.
Yes. That's
However, whether you're vaccinated or not, and whether you're from a country that can do that, it almost, it matters a bit in the short term. That you're never going to be okay unless you can actually work with the system, and the whole behavior of everything is actually a really big indicator of whether it's going to work for you. And if you're taking so much, and certainly, you kind of feel this need to kind of, I guess it's that, well, we wouldn't have funded it if we weren't going to make a huge profit from it.
Yeah,
it's that for me, there's something really interesting in that. That's just the way it is. It's ours, and we kind of hold on to it. And again, and for me, it's the stuff. A lot of these ideas arise from the system too.
Yes.
There is an individual and an organizational and a personal contribution to that, and I definitely want to see that rewarded, and it's important that it is. But in the case of the vaccines, I think, they're a really good example, because so much of that is founded on previous publicly funded, published academic research. So is it okay to then accrue all of that profit and hold it all very tightly when you were given something freely?
Yeah.
And I think that, for me, is a really interesting question, particularly when it doesn't, and the profit motive works in these really small spaces, or the absolute profit motive anyway. But eventually you get to a point of ridiculousness, because whatever it is, however much if you kind of dominate a market to the extent that, that you're the only operator, then the whole monetary system around you breaks down and there's no one to buy your stuff.
Yeah. And that's where we end up. God, it is so interesting. It is that that's the case, because we're going to live in fear until the point where the whole world is vaccinated. So it's all very well that we say, oh, we got our vaccinations, and Ireland and the UK and the rest of Europe may do quite well before the rest of the world does. But what do? We shut down our communities completely, and then we have a complete, heart attack when we see a plane flying in from a country that we know shouldn't be on a list. Are your odds on a red list? And is there a fear? Because that was what was told to Australia. When they first, I was Australia, I remember reading an interview at the time where the Swedish, the head of, now I know that didn't work out very well for Sweden, but the guy who was on the whole idea that herd immunity worked, he said, but the problem with Australia is that you can close Australia off, but you're going to be living in fear till the rest of the world rights itself. And, you know, and you're not going to gain any herd immunity, because Australia, you're doing nothing at the moment till somebody designs a vaccine. So you'll be in this state of fear till this happens, and how long that lasts, we don't know. This interview was roughly about a year ago, it was. So you can see that's the case that we're in. We're going to be in this state of fear, questioning where other people come from, you know.
I think at this stage in the show, I like to kind of move things slightly more practical direction, but I think you raised something really, really interesting in that with the fear thing. One of the really big things about that's just the way it is the emotions around this, and that, again, and another theme we've mentioned before really on the show is that thoughts don't pop out of nowhere. They arise from the context that we're in and from our previous experience, and they arise through our physical sensation and the input of physical information summarized into affect and feeling and emotion. They don't come out of nowhere, and I think that idea of anything kind of just popping in is a really difficult one. So if we're doing intellectual work, if we're doing problem-solving work that's reliant on thought, the emotional context in which we do that constrains the thoughts that we can have. So if we want to be able to do useful stuff, if you're thinking, okay, yeah, well, I want to challenge, you know, we're in an organization that does want to challenge the way that things are done in some way, then you're going to have to shake up how you feel about things. And we know from research that positive emotions actually open up more brain regions, quite simply. You know, we really do. In fear, we narrow down our cognitive capacity. In depression, we cut off bits of our brain.
Yes.
You know, we down-regulate quite large sections of prefrontal cortex to attend to other things. But if we're artificially doing that, if we're artificially creating a situation where people respond in that way, we cut off a whole load of capability that we'd otherwise have. It's a very strange way to engage with the world for an organization.
It is, yeah. And when it comes to work, I suppose for a lot of us, the idea of that, the words we associate with work, whether it's hard work, it's a battle and all that kind of stuff. And the idea that we just need to work through things to solve it, or for things to get better. Like, I'm a big advocate of taking breaks in work. Like, the body works in 90-minute to 120-minute cycles. It's called ultradian rhythms. And what actually happens in that 120-minute cycle or so is that the body then has to, after a while, has to start to process all the different information that it's taken and file it off into separate little folders inside of our brain. So that takes time, and it takes energy, and it causes us to get a bit tired and lethargic. And also the lymphatic system within inside of our body is also getting rid of all the waste within the blood system as well. So that has to happen. And if we don't take breaks every 90 minutes to 120 minutes and try to work through something, we're at a loss. We're really at a high to nothing, because it's not happening at all. Like all of those great, when you talk about Darwin and Dickens, what, 19 and 12 books between, you know, each, they worked for 4 hours a day in the morning writing, and then the rest of the afternoon walking, and allowing those ideas to be able to, you know, to ferment and to be able to, you know, come to fruition. And we don't allow enough of that in work, because we're trying to constantly be switched on all the time. There's a really good study was done, I think, with the Israeli parole boards. You ever heard that one before, where they discovered that, yeah, with the Israeli parole boards, if you were up in front of Israeli parole board for parole, and it was just before lunch, or it was just before you were due to go home, or just before the 11 o'clock break, you were less likely to get parole. But
we actually mentioned this on the show before. It's one of my favorite studies, or favorite. It's a terrifying study. And when you say less, I think the amount less is, for me, it was the shocking thing. Because if I remember rightly, at the outset, when people are happy and comfortable, it's about 2/3 of people get parole. And they found in the slot before lunch, in the whole study, no one got parole. That was a 0, you know, and it's that profound an effect. It's not just a little bit. And I think that's the other thing. People think, okay, we can kind of power through. We can kind of, you know, mind over matter, all of that stuff. That the mind and body don't really work that way, or they kind of do. They kind of try and accommodate you. And this is one of the other sides of it, really, is if you don't take breaks, your body does carry on, but your body assumes that the reason you're not taking breaks is because you're in an unsafe context.
Yes.
And it responds accordingly, but its response is only helpful if you are in a short-term unsafe context. And that's why you get cortisol, that's why you get the kind of stress hormones. And that's why but if you constantly stay in that, your body never gets to rest and repair. So you get digestive issues, you get sleep issues, you get congestive heart disease, and all of these kind of slow accumulating things because because you've actually been implicitly in your actions telling your body it wasn't safe.
And I think that's where we've got it wrong in so many ways in the workplace. It's the very Americanization of work. It's like the Europeans that left to go to America years ago decided to become these. I don't know whether it was the amalgamation of all the different cultures from, whether it was from Europe, different parts of the world, decided that work was going to have this really hard sort of outcome. I don't know whether it was the fact that they were Calvinists or I'm not quite sure. But over here, luckily in Europe, we're beginning to look at that a lot differently as well. Yeah, like anyone who has connections with, I think Norway, they take a whole month off in July. Is it July their month where they take a whole month off, and that's sort of factored into the way they get paid throughout the year, or they pay towards, so the whole country shuts down for a month. And I think there's some other Scandinavian countries that have that outlook on life. And I think we need to embrace more of that. The French are very much into that too as well. So we work less hours here in Europe, which is good. But a lot of the tech companies don't come from that sort of frame of mind. They're coming from the American frame of mind, where I know for anybody who's had to work in America, the 10-hour or the 10-day holiday, quota for the year seems to be the norm, and some of those don't even take all of them.
It's bizarre, and I think this is one of the really interesting things. If you are watching this thinking, okay, I'd like to if you're watching this thinking, I agree, and I'd like to implement it. Or actually, if you're watching this and feeling skeptical and thinking, well, it's just how it is, that isn't quite how it is. There is so much research emerging around this stuff, and really quite robust research. We're not talking about like little weakly powered studies. We're talking about some really big stuff and some meta studies and really quite deep, evidence-based stuff that suggests that there are real limits to the way, or the way that we're structuring work isn't actually the way that optimizes the kind of outputs that we're looking for. And what the one that really comes to me, when you were talking about 100-hour working week, is there's a pretty good research study that looking at knowledge work that suggests that once we get past 40 hours a week, our ability to do knowledge work drops off quite rapidly, really quite rapidly, to the point at which that for most people at about 50 hours a week, they start to make more mistakes than they fix. So this actually comes from an IT domain, so it's quite easy to measure. But that people start to make more mistakes, so they do more damage by being there for more than 50 hours a week than if they weren't. And the idea that then we're pushing people to 100-hour weeks is like, that is in no one's interest. That is not in the client's interest. That is not in the company's interest, and it's certainly not in the people doing that work's interest. So it's that kind of leaning back on the real evidence, I think, is actually the flip side of this connecting with emotion and context, because these things there's still, certainly in this country, a sense that humanness is a kind of soft thing, and it's not important in quite the same way to work. That we can't be, it's not social, it's all doing, and actually we need to attend to that. So if we start attending to that, partly because it's such a neglected domain, we get rewards really, really quickly.
Oh, listen, people love to open up. I've found it now more in the workplace now. We're getting more to the sort of spiritual and soulful side of the humans now than ever before. So the idea is that we have, like, in some stages, campfires, or sit around in circles and we talk about what leadership might have meant to us, or things that we would have never, ever sequestered years ago. Now we're beginning to see as these are things that really can be advantageous. You've got to remember that trust comes from vulnerability, and when we show that everybody within the organization is vulnerable, from the CEO right down, And that's where we talk about mistakes and the power of being able to make mistakes within an organization and have the freedom to understand that it can happen. It's very, very freeing. And all those organizations that do things like that, that celebrate making mistakes, are organizations that allow risks to be able to happen, but there's no retribution for them happening. Simple organizations like Ben and Jerry's are a great example of that. All those amazing flavors that Ben and Jerry's have come up with are simply guys messing around and meddling and hoping that it works. Like, they've tried 3 times to put hazelnut into ice cream and it's never worked. But they tried 3 times and now they've realized people don't want hazelnut in their ice cream. I thought so too, right? And I bought some lovely hazelnut ice cream last Friday night from an own brand, but deluxe range. It's from here in Ireland. And I brought it home, and it's Italian gelato hazelnut ice cream. And I now know why Ben and Jerry's decided not to. It's going to stay in the freezer a lot longer than I thought it was going to stay. But I get the idea. So I like the idea of that they're able to allow for those mistakes. Before then, you would have been severely reprimanded. You would have been told that you had to leave the organization, and would have stayed on your record. And like, they have a flavor graveyard over in Vermont where you can go and visit the flavor that you love the most, and you can see that it's been put into a graveyard, and you can stand over and say a few prayers and shed a few tears. But I like that idea,
I think there's something really interesting in this, and one of the reasons, I think one of the big, that's just the way it is. One of the big things is to do something different, to kind of, if there's been a direction, there's been an organization, and we can do more of the same in that direction, but doing something different feels almost disloyal. It can feel like it's disloyal to the people that have come before, and to your colleagues still doing the same thing, and even to yourself and your previous efforts. I think thinking about that in a different way, and thinking about, okay, we're going to do something different, but that's that in a way that honors what was before. It's not actually about saying, well, that was wrong. It's like, that was right for then, now's different, and we're going to do something different, and maybe now's different just because we know we've done it. We're not interested anymore, or we've got we know enough from that. We understand that now. I think approaching it that way, and letting go of that idea that the best way to respect and to honor what's been up until now is to continue doing it in the same way. I don't think that's true.
No, and I like the ideas of being able to sort of change it completely. One of the things that's like, when I talk about, like, in the workplace wouldn't have been a very inclusive place years ago. The format that you would have had at meetings was the loudest voice got heard the most, and his ideas were the ones, his or her ideas came to the forefront more. Yes, usually his. You're absolutely right, and that's the way it just was. And the men made the decisions. Like that supermarket chain that's based over here that I've just bought that ice cream from, that I'm not going to eat any more of. I remember that organization 20 years ago, that all the managers in the organization were called Mr. It wasn't called Dave. They weren't called Matthew. They were called Mr. Morrison, Mr. Bellringer, Mr. Dargan. And that's the way all the employees had to refer to them. Now, that's no longer done. But at the time, that was seen as an impossible idea for somebody to say at a board meeting, is there any chance that we could just call people by their first names, including the managers? Because that would have, been thrown out. Like, I remember being at a meeting years ago. I used to ask lots of questions, and I bring this up a lot of time in when I do talks, is that I used to ask a lot of questions because I was just curious about why things were done this way. Why? Just why? It's like the 9 whys. Just keep asking why, and then you'll get to the nub of why you shouldn't do it, why you shouldn't be there in the first place. And I just asked questions, and I remember a senior manager after the meeting took me aside and said, Stephen, he said, ours is not to wonder why. Ours is just to do or die. From the Tennyson poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Just do as I can say, and don't ask questions. And I just thought about that afterwards. Is that the way it is everywhere in the organization? When somebody, asks a question and it doesn't sort of align with the way you're thinking, do suddenly we not go down that road? Or do we shut that person off? And the best organizations are the ones that allow everyone's voice to be to be heard. It's the organizations that can create spaces for introverts to be able to talk. They're the really good organizations, and they're creating those psychological safe spaces. We talk about Google have gone really well into this field. Project Aristotle is the field where they've taken the Amy Edmondson stuff from 1999, where she looked about psychological safety and how we can create that in the workplace. And I think allowing people in organizations to be able to say what they need to be able to say without fear of retaliation or anybody, shouting them down are the best organizations, because we've got all these people within organizations that never had a voice before. And if you can give them a voice, it's amazing how many creative ideas, like Steve Wozniak never would have been that voice within Apple, because he didn't have, the ability to be able to shout about what he did. He was just the programmer that came up with all the brilliant ideas. And luckily, between him and Jobs, they managed to create what they did. But in many organizations, he mightn't have been as effective.
I think what's interesting is certainly a lot of the quieter and more introverted people that I've worked with, and obviously working in technology, it does tend to skew that way to some degree, is that they actually ask some very pointed questions. Sometimes when they do just ask questions, very blunt questions, and sometimes simply in what they do and what they create. And it's like that can be challenging as well, because it's like, here's a thing that means that you have to think about this thing completely differently. And that's actually a very challenging thing for organizations as well. And I think if we're talking about practical steps, for me, there's a couple of things in there. First of all, as leaders, as an organization, it's inviting questions. Not just because most of us will have been punished for it at some point in the past. Some of us are so led to it that we almost can't help ourselves. And I count myself in that category. I think I'm probably the only person I know who's bored a toddler in the why game. I don't know if you've ever played, like toddlers, like when you speak to a toddler and they're like, and a small kid, and they're like, why? And then you give them an answer and they're like, why?
Yes. I
a couple of times now, I've managed to be like, I'm still going. And the kid's like, oh, right then, bye. So I definitely have, I'm very comfortable with that. But not everyone is. And I think creating a situation, seeking to create an invitation where people can ask questions,
yes.
not ever punishing questions.
Yes.
And doing that, but equally modeling it for yourself and asking questions. And asking questions as a leader is really difficult, because it means potentially saying, well, I don't know all the answers. And letting go of working with that. But what it does is, first of all, it models that it's okay to do it. And second of all, it starts to make it a practice. Because I think one of the things, and this is again one of the emerging themes on this show, is that there is value in well-asked questions. There is skill in asking good questions. Actually, many of the people I invite on are basically paid for their ability to ask questions, not their ability to give answers. And I do the same. And one of the ways I understand my work is that actually I'm helping people give people a better set of questions that they can then ask to evaluate future situations and to work out their own situation, rather than saying, okay, well, this is your answer here, here, and here. And I think that understanding that and building that as a capability, thinking about that as an organizational capability, is a really, really good way to start doing this work. It's like, how well do we ask questions of ourselves and of each other? And what can we do to play with that and experiment with that and ask better questions?
Yeah. And I think that's it. And that's one of the things that I teach the leaders in the organizations, how to have those courageous conversations with people within the organization how to ask the right questions. Actually, I have a team of leaders at the moment in an organization, and I've asked them purposely for the next month to make no decisions within the organization. So they can't. So every time that one of the team members comes to them with a problem, they've got to push back onto them. Well, what do you think we should do? Frame the question in the right way so that they get the right answer. Not just the right answer, but they understand that they are there to support that person to come up with the answer themselves. So it's empowering the people that they work for. And it's incredibly powerful. I don't know if you know the David Marquette story. It's quite famous. David is the naval commander for a nuclear submarine. Yes, and that's a lovely story. And for anybody who hasn't heard that before, it's just the idea that David spent a whole year learning how to run a particular naval submarine, and it got to the end of the year and they said, sorry, that's not available for you. We need you to move on to another submarine, which he knew nothing about. And then he arrives on it, knowing nothing about it, and then discovering there was going to be an audit in the next couple of weeks. So he couldn't make any decisions. He just didn't know how anything worked. So he had to draw his staff together, all the guys on the submarine who were used to being told, this is the way you do it. I'm the commander-in-chief. You do this, you did this. And they just took orders and did it. And to flip it completely around, he said, I'm going to have to take your lead on this. And it became the highest ranking nuclear submarine in the US Marines ever. It hasn't been bettered. And he did that by simply making no decisions whatsoever and empowering people to do it. So go ahead.
Which I think is, and that idea of actually being okay with that, because this landed for me a few years ago when I was an IT manager, and I realized actually I was in charge of a whole bunch of people who were all much more domain experts in their technology than I was. It's like, well, how can I tell them what they should do when they're an expert? Either we're not getting value out of them because we're following my opinion, which is less expert in this thing than they are, or or we're just, it feels like a really strange assumption actually when put in those terms. Everyone's an expert in what they do day in, day out. Mm-hmm. And if you're leading people, you're holding the big picture. You don't, the individuals are always going to know their stuff better than you do. And that's a very healthy thing. And I think allowing that, even cultivating that, is actually really quite important.
Yeah, but the problem is that, isn't it? There's lots of things that try to jump in and stop that. It's our ability to want to control things, our ability that we know the answer to the problem quicker, we know the solutions. So a lot of us are what we call diminishers, which means we think we're multiplying by what we're doing. We think when we go in to rescue the situation because we know the answer to the problem, that we're solving a problem looking like a superhero and everybody wins. But the truth is that the people are not gaining any more knowledge of how to solve that problem because you're the one that's jumping in every time and fixing it. Everybody feels fine because the problem is fixed. But what happens in the day when you're not around? So we feel good as rescuers, and there's lots of other diminishing tasks that we do where if we're the optimist in some organizations, that's not good. You want to be an optimist and working for a decommissioning a nuclear power plant. Probably we need pessimists in those roles to be able to look for the threats that might come from that. Yet we get caught up in those ideas, so we become these diminishers in many ways. Within organizations, simply because of who we are as leaders. We want control, we want power, we want people to see that we shine or whatever, and we want relevance in many ways. Like Google years ago tried to get rid of the leaders in 2002 and struggled because the engineers didn't want to be managed, and so they got rid of them. And within the space of a very short period of time, the guy that was the one manager of all the engineers in the organization was so overwhelmed they had to reinstall managers, and it was only in 2008 they re-looked at that idea, and that's where they came up with Project Oxygen, and they realized that the greatest leaders are good coaches, and they certainly don't micromanage, and then they look at the people that work for them as humans, and they treat them as so. And they're the three most important tasks of a really good leader: being able to stand back away from people, don't micromanage them, and just empower them to become the best people that they can be, find their strengths and do that. And that's one of the things that we help organizations be able to do. But we see it as different, that leaders should be just people that tell people to do stuff all day long. And that's not the way it should be. A really good example of that is Ricardo Semler from Semco. And Semco, when I read that book, Maverick, back in the 90s, and just was blown away by it. Here was a guy who took over an organization who saw the people queuing up to come into the factory that morning, and saw them coming up to the clocking in station, saw them clocking in and went, why? Why do people have to clock in? Had that question with himself. Thought about this. Why do people need to clock in? And the more you ask the question, we go, well, we need to know where they are. Why do we need to know where they are? Well, because if they're not there, they might be somewhere else. Why do we think they'll be somewhere, and what's happening? Because we don't trust them. And so he contacted all the union members. When he contacted the union members and he brought them in and he said, listen, guys, I'm thinking of getting rid of the clocking system in the factory. And they went, whoa, hang on a second, you're getting rid of the clocking system? Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me. Let the people come in, let them self-regulate. They'll be able to do that. And then the union said, hang on a second, you're going to have a think about this, because this sounds I think you're up to something. So they went off and they came back and they said, listen, we're really worried here that your idea of getting rid of the clocking system, because, in Rio de Janeiro, or Sao Paulo, sorry, we have 10 minutes grace by law for any worker that comes in. They have to arrive in at 8, they've got till 8:10 to clock in. And he said, well, yes, but that all goes. None of that's needed anymore. So you don't need to worry about that. And he said, still, we're not happy. We're not happy. We think there's something up here. And he simply said to them, he said, what's the address of your union offices in downtown Sao Paulo? And they said, well, why do you want to know that? He said, well, I want to meet you there. Let's have a meeting and let's have it on your offices and on your terms. And they said, no one's ever said that to us before. And he said, well, here we are. And that's it. And Semco, or an organization, is still unionized to this day. But the difference is they get on well with their unions. They're part of the process instead of fighting them.
I think that's a really interesting Really interesting point to bring us kind of towards the end of this. Though I think, one of the things I always really like to do on the show and in life in general is I noticed my camera's frozen. That's nice. Aside from the where are we? Okay, right. Good. Is one of the things I like to do is really kind of work in exactly the mode that we're talking about. And I know before the show we were talking about the challenge of the reintroduction to the workplace, and that lots of organizations are facing this as a big dilemma: how you do it, how it works, how to work it, how to make sure that it all goes smoothly. Now, kind of integrating what we do know and making sure that we're kind of carrying the good stuff that's happened over the last year, and getting back the stuff that we lost or some of that before, and really, feeling into that a bit. Interestingly, my partner is at her back in her office for the first day for months and months. Certainly this year. So it's a really very timely conversation, a very timely point to me. But so I think it's really important to note that this is an exploration, and we're talking about exploring stuff, but because we can't know exactly what's going to happen and how to do this, so it's exactly in these terms. But is there something is that something you'd like to talk to people about, or in?
Yeah, we were only talking about this morning, and this reintroduction into the workplace, which is going to be difficult for many people, or it's going to be new for many people. And there's a comfort that we've got from being away from the working environment. The long commute is gone, and the comfortability of home maybe have overtaken the office space as it is. So there's probably going to be a blend of what happens when people go back into work. Some might decide to work 3 days a week if the organization allows within the working space, and maybe 2 at home, or reverse that around. But even for those organizations that have to have people in, we're working on helping them with a program. It's a one-day program with this reintroduction into the workplace. And it involves a couple of different things, but it also, we've integrated little rituals in that, where we get rid of the things that may have sort of reminded us of the negatives of what we just experienced over the past 14 months, and how we can step forward into the positives. And with that as well, is that how can we get the employees within the organization, alongside the management, but the employees are involved, about what is the organization, what is the shape of the organization, what does the organization look like into the future? Because things are going to be different. They cannot be the way they were 14 months ago. We can't continue with them. That's gone. So now we're moving into a sphere now that involves the employees with the decisions about what the organization they want to work in will look like. And I think that's vitally important for any organization. Everybody needs to be involved in this process. What do you want it to look like, and how can that be shaped? And what does it take to get there? World of work is changing, and it's changing forever. And we are never going back to where we were before. And we've got to realize that. And if you think it is going back to the way it was before, you're slightly you're behind the curve when it comes to this.
I think, from my perspective, well, I mean, you can choose to take any advice you like or not, but I would look at for me, anyone who thinks it isn't going to change and we're going to go back to normal, back to exactly as things were before, I just invite them to look at history and see whether that's ever happened before. Because I don't think it has. So again, this is the kind of the stick side of it's time to update. We can do better, and that's a joyful thing. That's a nice thing for us to be able to do. So brilliant. So if someone wants to get in touch with you about that, what's the best way to do it? We've got your LinkedIn details on the
they can contact me. They can see my email address. I've also got Stephen at wakeup.ie or wakeup.ie. They can contact me through that, or certainly through LinkedIn, and message me on that. It seems to be the place where everybody seems to be able to go, and I'll be delighted to be able to talk to them about how we can help them. It's all about creating those workplaces, helping those leaders in organizations to be able to create workplaces that light people up. And let's make our people feel good. And if they feel good, everything else begins to change with that. Societies, communities, relationships, life in general. There is a better way. There is a better way.
Yeah, and it's in a better way that's available to us, to everyone. I think that's the really important thing, I think, that's coming out of this particular show, is not so much that, this idea that that's just the way it is a fixed thing. I think that really the assumption that we've been exploring in a little way is more that's just the way it is for the likes of you. And I think that is definitely the one I'd like to challenge. I think if we're saying, so yeah, it's all connected, and we're all kind of doing this, and we can't choose to disconnect. It can't be disconnected. So we work in a way that takes that into account and takes benefit from that.
Yeah, and I want people to understand that the whole idea of creating workplaces where people feel happier about themselves isn't just something that's in the domain of the Googles and the big companies that have lots of money that can create these beautiful offices. I've been to the offices, and they are beautiful in Google's headquarters. I've been to the ones in London too, all the beautiful things that they have in the experience. But it's much deeper than that. And Google know that themselves, because they do lots of really good core work behind that to be able to create that. It's not the slides, it's not the the colourful beanbag places and the places to be able to have those little outlets, or the Amsterdam offices with the cycle lanes that go through it. They're all add-ons. But there's got to be good work done behind that, and it's simpler than you think. It's not about creating this expensive hybrid workplace that looks like half like a child's play area and half like a workplace. It's deeper than that. It's about working with your people to create, how we can get the best out of them.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed, really interesting conversation. Quite wide ranging as well, and touched on all sorts of really interesting topics. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, Matthew.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for watching. I really do, it is the viewers that make this possible. I do like spending my entire life going around the world, having interesting conversations, or certainly going around the virtual world, and as things are at the moment, and would probably do it anyway, but it's the viewership that mean I can do it in this way, and talk to people like Stephen. So thank you very much. Other recordings are available on the YouTube channel. You can catch all the back episodes, some of which I mentioned. So please do check that out. There's also a podcast version of this available if you prefer listening to the audio side of things. You can search Delightful Dissent on your favorite podcast platform and it should turn up. I hope that our conversation today got you thinking. If it did, reach out and ask, reach out and talk to us. Reach out and talk to someone else. Just reach out and talk to someone, because for me, that's really what this is about. It's about stimulating conversation and starting these, asking questions and getting things moving. The next episode, I'm going to be talking to Abby Rebecca, and we're going to be talking about the phrase or the saying, "Who do you think you are?" First of all, there's a bit of a theme around song titles emerging, which I rather like. And second of all, I think this really does play into this whole thing, this idea of it not being for the likes of you to challenge the way things are. It's okay for the big tech companies to do it, or it's okay for the, for the CEO to do it, but it's not okay for the likes of you, or it's not okay for you as a solopreneur. You've got to be a certain size before you can really challenge stuff and all of that stuff. And I think it's really, I really want to get into this one. It's definitely also a question I've spent an awful lot of unnecessary energy and effort and time worrying about answering, with no real goal. So I'm really looking forward to getting to that one. And that's going to be 5 p.m. UK time on Thursday, the 20th of May. So a week and a couple of days. I'd love to see you all there. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Goodbye.